Good morning, students, and welcome to History class. Whether you are in grade 7 or you are in grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, or no matter where you are, welcome to Introduction to History. And today we'll be talking about all things history from what is history, who studied history, what's the purpose of history, sources of history, careers in history, and timeline. We'll be discussing all these and more. What is history? History is the study of past events, particularly in human affairs. Now, what does that mean? It means everything that happened in the past that has to do with humans is history. So, what happened last year was history. What happened in January was history. What happened in 2019, 1989, 1985, what happened to your grandparents, your great great grandparents, your parents, and what will happen to you is history. Once we study any events, any occurrences, any activities, any phenomenon that has to do with human that happened in the past, that is history. And we study history chronologically. History is studied chronologically, a chronological record of past events affecting a nation or institution. So once we study the chronological records of past events of people or institution, that is history. I'm sure you're wondering, what does the word chronological mean? It means that we study it in order of how it occurs. So if we were studying your life, we'd study it from the day you were born until the day you die in that order. We do not study history randomly or backwards, but we study in chronological order from first to last, or from the latest to the most correct. Now, why do we study history? And we will look at a famous quote from the famous Marcus Garvey. A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Now, as a nation, we want to grow, we want to flourish, and we want to blossom like a beautiful tree. Without history, we are not able to do that because we fail to study history. We run the risk of repeating the mistakes of the past and not understanding and appreciating why things are the way now. Now, what are the purposes of history, you may ask? Knowledge of history helps us to understand the past. We understand why things were the way they are and why things are the way they are now. We understand the roles of our forefathers and the roles of our foreparents. We understood the trials they went through and the accomplishments and failure they made. Secondly, history explains how and why the society is in its present state. To understand why your country is the way it is now, you must take a glance into the past, into yesterday, to understand how did we come to where we are now. And thirdly, it helps us to recognize trends and patterns that will help us to determine the future. So history allows us to recognize trends and patterns. So if something happened in 1989 and it's happening now in 2020, we can predict what might happen as a result of these events and activities. For example, we're currently facing the pandemic of COVID. People will look back at the history of how we dealt with lupus and other diseases in the past. How did it spread? How badly did it affect a nation? And what did they do? And that is the reason why they quickly know that quarantine, self-isolation, distancing was a way to go, because something like this happened in the past. We study the pattern and the trend and know how to act in the future. Sources of history. A source is a place, person, or thing from which something originates or can be obtained. So the sources of history is where we go to find our historical information. It is who we go to. It is what we go to and what we listen to in able to make our historical information. Now, we go to primary sources, secondary sources, oral sources, and physical remains. By primary source, I mean the origin. Anything that was created at the time of origin is called a primary source. So, your diary will become a primary source. Your letters will become a primary source. Your birth certificates will become a primary source. A recording of you performing become a primary source. Once it is created in the time an event being investigated, it is considered a primary source. However, a secondary source is created after the event, and it is normally created based on the primary source. So we use our primary sources to create things like textbooks and articles and movies. So a movie about my life is a secondary source because it was created after my life. A book about my life is a secondary source. So anything created about the event after the event is a secondary source. Next, we go to oral traditions. Now, oral traditions is anything passed on by word of mouth, such as recipes and Nancy stories, proverbs, even songs. Anything that we pass from one generation to the next by word of mouth is considered a oral tradition. And finally, we have physical remains. Physical remains include artifacts, photographs, old ornaments, anything that you find that was created in the time that's been studied and it survived into the present time. It's called physical remain, otherwise known as artifacts. Now that you know what is an oral tradition and what are written records and what are physical remains, you are supposed to write a description. Create a table looking like this one in your books and you write a description and give an example. So we need an example of an oral tradition. We need exactly what an oral tradition is. I'll give you one example. And a recipe is an oral tradition. Some parents will never write down their recipes, but they'll teach their children while cooking that you need a dash of that and a pinch of this to make the pudding. And so, a oral tradition, please write the description and an example. Same thing for written records. I'll give you an example of a written record. My diary is a written record. No, you give me two more examples of a written record. And for an artifact, an old photograph is my artifacts because it is an item that survived the past. Give me two more examples in your books. Measuring the times. How do we measure time? How do we measure? How do we know? What do we say? Now, an era is a distinct period of time. So if I want to talk about the Asian Revolution, I can say the era of Asian Revolution. Or I want to talk about enlightenment, the era of enlightenment. Or if in future I want to talk about the COVID pandemic, I will say the era of the great COVID pandemic. It is a word used to describe a distinct period in time. The era of the Morant Bay Rebellion, the era of slavery, the era of Queen Elizabeth. So it is a word used to describe a distinct period in time. Now, if I want to say that this board was made 10 years ago, I don't have to say 10 years ago. Instead, I can say this board was built a decade ago. Because a decade is a period of 10 years. So if you are 20, you have lived 2 decades. If you are 15, you have lived a decade and 5 years. Next, we have century, and a century is 100 years. So if something happened 100 years ago, we'd say that happened a century ago. Next, we have millennial, and a millennial is 1,000 years ago. You'll hear it if you go to church. They say Christ was born over 2 millennials ago. It means he was born over 2,000 years ago. Next, we have annominial, which means annual or yearly, followed by BCE, before the Common Era. So the word Common Era, if you look, you'll see it's the acronym for it is CE, and Common Era means present time. So if I say BCE, I mean before the present time, before the Common Era. And of course, we have AD, which is the year of our Lord, Anno Dominium, before the year of our Lord. Now that you know, let us look at calculating a century. Now, how do we calculate a century? Let's first look. To calculate a century, you need to find the hundred. And after you found the hundred figure, you have to add 1 to the hundredth figure. You carry down the thousand figure and ignore the tenth figure. Let's look at the example below. It is the year 2017. The hundred column will be the 0. We add 1 to the 0 and we bring down the 2, which is the thousand column, which gives us what? To 21st century. And we ignore the 1s and the 10 column. Now, with that being said, which centuries are these before us today? If we are going to do that, the year 1 to 99 is the first century, and the year 100 to 199 is the second century. So what can you fill out the missing columns for me? Try. See if you will get them right. Share to their teacher and get her feedback. Which centuries are these? Can you use the formula that I just presented to you to calculate the centuries correctly? Which centuries are these before you? This is an activity for you to complete. Remember, a century is every year. And remember the formula for a century. We found the 100 column, we carry down the 1000 column, and we ignore the 1s and the 10 column. Let us see. Please put below the answers to these questions. If you are able to do so, comment below. Next, we have careers in. Why would you want to study? You might ask, what will this do for my life? How can it enhance my career? How is knowing about all men and all things going to help me? Guess what? If you want any of these careers, this is the subject of thought. You want to be an historian? Study history. You want to be a teacher of history? Study history. You'd like to be a librarian? History is a study of choice. An archaeologist, an anthropologist, an archivist, an journalist, if you want to go into journalism, an information management specialist, or a creator of beautiful art and artifacts and work in museum. These are the careers that studying history will help you to undertake. Now, what are the beautiful elements of history? I like to consider history as a story, as you'll see from the word, his story. And every story has a time, once upon a time, and your time is your date. Every story has a place. Once upon a time in the beautiful island of Jamaica, that's your place and your environment. A beautiful prince, and a prince is your who? Govern the people. And as you know, you must have a place, a time, a people, and you must have an event. And you also must have, it must be from the past, and it must have a cause and an effect. Every event is caused by something, and every event affects something. And so when you study history, you study the what, where, when, who, why. And those elements are known as time, place, people, past, effects, and causes. Those are the elements of history, the elements of the story of our past. Now, history is recorded on what we call a timeline. A timeline is a graphical representation of a period of time in which important events are recorded. So, a timeline is a graphic, which means that it's something we draw, it's a display, and it will show the events and it will show the time. Now, I want you to research what are the two different types of timelines. Let me tell you, there are two main types of timeline, the vertical timeline and the horizontal timeline. Go and find two examples of a vertical and an horizontal timeline. Now that we know these things about history, let us recap with these questions. Answer these questions below or answer them in your textbook. What is history? Do you remember what history is? It is the study of past events. Very good. Followed by recorded how? In which order do we record history? Is it randomly or is it chronologically? Please tell me in the comments below. These three purposes of history. I wonder why we say, what does history tell us about our present? How does history help us to understand the past? And how can I use it to predict the future? What is the purpose of history? And finally, not finally, but fourthly, what are the sources of history? Where do I go find historical information? Where do I go for the wealth of knowledge about my past? Tell me the sources of history below, won't you? And list three types of three types of sources, and also tell me what are sources. As you elaborate, try and recall for me what is oral tradition, what is written tradition, and what are physical artifacts. And of course, if we talk about history, we must know what is AD, CE, BCE, and era. What does these letters stand for? Can you tell me? Can you remember? And finally, what are three careers you can gain by studying history? And what are the elements of history? And what is a timeline? I hope that as you watch this video about what is history, how we find information about history, how we measure the time of history, and the purpose of history, that you will be informed, you'll be educated, and you will share this knowledge. Have a great class, my historians. Remember to explore the world around you, past, present, and future.